My first point, it would relate directly to the theme of this session, which is that what is over the last 10 years, the regional security changes. I guess what we are learning about our region is that this decade has proved that the issue of the governance of diverse societies is absolutely key to the security and stability of the region. And I say governance, and I insist on the word governance for two reasons. First, the institutions that regulate relations within a society are what determines relations among groups. And secondly, we have had governments that have dealt in a very irresponsible way, and sometimes in a criminal way, with the issue of diversity within society and manipulated state institutions in that direction. This, I think, is the lesson that we need to learn, that the answer to these problems come from the state, from the governance, and that we should have perhaps defined good governance by taking this as a key criterion for defining it. It is bad governance of diversity that has sowed distrust, fragmented society, and led, in some cases, to mass killings and conflict. That is one major aspect of the last decade. One aspect that relates perhaps more directly to the post-Arab Spring and the Arab uprisings, and perhaps is affecting mostly Syria, Iraq, and Libya, although Iraq should not be in that category, is that over the last 4 years almost, there has been an important shift in how the region and the political movements that have mobilized over that period have changed. And that is that we definitely had Islamist groups on the rise in the beginning of the Arab Spring. That was the case in the Syrian context because of the fueling of the armed conflict by funding, basically financing of military groups with an Islamist bent. And that has brought into Syria a lot of the Islamist discourse and ideology that is not very often related to the reality of this country and its social fabric initially. But what has happened is that over that period, what occurred in Egypt was a turning point in the sense that we now have a message that the armies, military apparatus, and security apparatus are seen as the best to be able to prevent extremism, but that extends in many cases to defining any Islamist movement as extremist, which is not always helpful, but that basically it will be the military that can keep the status quo and keep countries together and keep the borders as they were. There is a lesson there. In a post-conflict context, there's definitely a need to rebuild the security apparatus because there is a physical danger for communities. And there is no way we can speak of a political solution, of capacity building of state institutions without beginning with, unfortunately, with the military apparatus. In the Syrian context, I think we are looking at exiting a dictatorship in a context of a war against terror. And in that context, we know we need the international community, but that the international community, whether at the regional level, but more importantly at the international level, looks at the region as having a number one issue to deal with, and that is the war on ISIS, the war on terror. There is here a very important dimension of this war in the context where it is growing at the moment. And I believe the war focused on Iraq at the moment is perhaps making the Syrian situation more complex rather than resolving it or even putting it on hold. The idea that we deal with Iraq first and Syria will come afterwards, there are good reasons to believe that the risk is very high that the consolidation of Daesh inside Syria is going to be stronger as a result of the war and the lack of a strategy for the Syrian theater of operation. Yes, it is one. What happens in Iraq has strong repercussions in Syria and vice versa, but the lack of a strategy, of a comprehensive strategy in Syria at the moment is definitely complicating the situation there in very alarming ways. I would like perhaps to focus specifically on this aspect. The fact that we do not have a strategy for Syria. Yesterday we heard from both the French Minister of Defense as well as the British Minister, Minister Hammond, that there is no transition in Syria with the presence of Bashar al-Assad. Now, this is a reassuring statement, but it is not very helpful because we do not see much of a strategy behind that. At the moment, Syria is definitely in need of fighting terrorism. And those groups on the ground that have been fighting the regime in their large majority understand that the threat of ISIS is one that is absolutely key and needs to be confronted. There is no understanding of the fact that these groups on the ground are perfectly willing to be involved in a war against ISIS. And many of these groups are even willing to give priority to fighting ISIS if they are reassured about the end game, if they are told there is a strategy that will build, that brings a suppression, elimination of ISIS, and then a solution to the threat and the crimes that are committed by the regime. That is one that dictates a comprehensive strategy, both at the military level and obviously later at a political level. At the military level, at the moment, it is clear that there is an absolute need and an urgent need for a mechanism of stabilization. The program for training and equipping military groups, vetted groups, is itself finding it very difficult to define criteria about how you vet and who you vet, on what criteria you vet. And that is also an indication that if you do not say what the strategy is and what the end game is, it will be very, very difficult to identify individuals or groups whose loyalty can be guaranteed over a period of time. The adherence of these groups is dependent on the definition of a strategy that brings stabilization. It needs enforcement, it needs pacification first, fighting ISIS as well as the regime. And in that context, this idea of a stabilization force is one that extends the program of train and equip in ways that define clearly the enemy is ISIS as well as the regime. If we are looking at the root causes, we need to go in that direction. Otherwise, it is clear that there will be more spoilers for the US and the coalition strategy than there will be groups who will cooperate. And finally, I will say a word about the political solution. I think there is a lot that Syrians can do among themselves. They can definitely set the agenda and say clearly where they need outside support and international support. But they can also say how the sequencing of a solution can occur. There is definitely need in the beginning of the process for regional countries to halt their delivery of any aid, military support to the regime, as well as to the fighting groups against the regime. But there is also a need to withdraw some of these militias that have entered and are fighting directly on the side of the regime. The sequencing of a political solution is now something that Syrians can see clearly. The stabilization, again, is a key factor. So defining the outline of a political settlement, the framework of a political settlement, is one that brings immediately the military and security apparatus to be at the heart of a political process. And by that, I am referring to the loyalist army as well as the Free Syrian Army. The capacity to merge on agreed criteria that guarantee, again, the security of all Syrian communities is, in the minds of the responsible opposition in Syria, a priority. And that, I think, is understood. And for anyone who wants to hear what the opposition is saying, I think it is saying clearly that that is one absolute priority before we can make it possible for the political framework to be implementable and to be implemented. There is another dimension, and that is the dealing with the diversity issue. Is it a secular constitution that will make it? I believe Syria needs a political system that keeps away or keeps neutral from any religious affiliation. We are extremely alarmed at the fact that the Christian communities have become an international issue. The international community cannot manage the Christians of Syria, nor any of the minorities of Syria. It is for a political system to do so, and for the governance system to do so. Likewise, the Kurdish issue will be a test case for the success of a new political system. If it is functioning, the Kurds will want to be part of it. If it is not, they will want to drift with an agenda of their own. And therefore, the problem does not lie so much with what their aspirations are, as much as it depends on what kind of a functioning governance system is established. So that tells us it is about how the administrative central state versus local governance is defined, is definitely, after the military and security dimension, a key aspect or a priority to define in order to signal to all communities that they will have the right place within the political system. And finally, this is where, of course, comes the international community in terms of assistance. The Syrians are in need of everyday food at the moment, which, as you know, is being reduced rather than even maintained, while the number of needy Syrians is growing. The reconstruction process will be daunting. We know what a huge task that will be, but the preparation for that is something that is positive enough for Syrians to mobilize beyond their sectarian, beyond the sectarian divide. I think we have many indications that this is also in preparation if the international community is able to support it financially. I'll stop there. Thank you.
So much, and there's so much on the agenda that we'll want to bring out.